This is Dennis Rundy. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, our podcast and YouTube channel, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. And if I could ask all of our listeners and viewers to hit the subscribe button. It doesn't cost anything, but we would appreciate it. Also, I want to start by thanking everyone out there who's contributed to help keep us on the air. We are not a nonprofit. It's not a donation, but the contributions help keep us going and help keep our show and our archives, which have about 300 shows in them, interviews in them, open and free to the public. Many great guests, and another great guest today. Our guest today is Amy Edelstein, author, educator, and public speaker. She is the founder and executive director of Inner Strength Education, a nonprofit organization that supports youth development. And I should mention, its innovative teen mindfulness and systems thinking program has empowered over 17,000 high school students in the under-resourced schools in Philadelphia. Amy is also the co-founder of Emergence Education Press, which is dedicated to bringing insightful and transformative ideas to the fore so that we can create a more compassionate and inspired world. Amy, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on to speak with us today.
Thank you. It's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Great.
And we should also mention that we'll be talking about your new book, Adventure in Zanskar, along with your other work. But let's begin where we usually like to begin, with asking our guests to give a brief overview of their spiritual history. What got you interested in the realm of spirituality, and what brought you to this work in education that you're doing?
Like probably many of your guests, it's a long story that could have many different interpretations. With you, I'll say that I had my earliest spiritual experiences that I remember when I was about 8. And I grew up in a secular Jewish family. My father was a particle physicist, and he happened to go on sabbatical to Israel. We had no real Jewish identity at that point. And I loved it there. And I wandered around the ruins and I remembered things. I remembered things in the desert. I learned the language really quickly. I felt at home in a way that I had never really felt at home. I had a good family, but I just all of a sudden kind of connected to almost like a different continuum or stream that was familiar, deeply familiar. Nobody else in my family had that experience. I kept a journal at the time. I started writing when I was that age, and I was a voracious reader. And I wrote about spiritual matters, about life and death, about what continues. I had a pet parrot that died, and the parakeet, and I wrote all about death and continuation. And I was really pondering those questions, and I was deeply happy. I felt at home. So that really set me going. I started studying. We were in a Reconstructionist congregation, which was very liberal. And I grew up in Pittsburgh, in the 70s. So it was a very cynical time in the 70s. And I was a hippie, kind of angry at the world and angry at the 60s for not working out and wondering what was next. I had a friend who taught me meditation, and I had a couple books. I'd Be Here Now. I had Autobiography of a Yogi. And those were the 2 books that got me going. And Richard Hittleman's 28-Day Guide to Yoga. He was he was an early yogi teaching LA housewives how to flatten their tummies. And I started meditating with his book. And then at night, I went to Hebrew high school. So I was learning Jewish ethics, and I was immersing myself in meditation, and I was in the counterculture of the 70s in a city that had no alternative culture. I mean, Pittsburgh was just really industrial, family, immigrant. So long story short, I kept seeking, It led me many places. And in college, I started studying some Eastern teachings. I went to Kripalu Ashram in, I think in 1980, when it was still in Pennsylvania, for a couple weeks. And I met Ada Roshi, who did a lecture at Cornell where I was studying. Eventually, I left school ostensibly to go to Japan to write a paper about rural women's role in Japan. But I went to Thailand and I turned left. And I followed the stories that I heard about Burma. And I went to this Buddhist country, which I loved. Then I went to Nepal. I started doing longer retreats. And when my visa ran out in Nepal, I went to India, and I spent the better part of 4 years in North India. And that was really where I studied with Buddhist teachers, Hindu teachers. I studied with the Dalai Lama's tutor in Dharamsala in the early 80s, Kirti Senchab Rinpoche. And I was at Shivananda Ashram with the great Swami Krishnananda and Swami Chidananda. I did retreats with Western Buddhist teachers. Whoever I could meet, I met. And eventually, I ended up coming back to the West and was one of the early members of a residential meditation community where I lived for 27 years doing
Wow.
research, practice, really working closely with a small group of people to explore consciousness, integral theory, evolutionary philosophy, writing for a magazine, interviewing people. And so I've spent the better part of 40 years on the path.
Let me ask you, well, it's a fascinating journey you've been on, and most people on our show have had fascinating journeys, but yours had more twists and turns and probably more exposure to different traditions than most. And my question, two questions, would be: number one, was there one teacher that really stood out for you that became your teacher or guru, or somebody that you put as your primary teacher? And the second question is, when you started to teach and share all the knowledge that you learned with others, did you follow a particular angle on it? Was it a particular technique, or did you sort of take a sort of a conglomeration of everything that you've studied and create your own sort of focus of teaching? So those two questions.
I would say really I've had so many influences. And what I found was that in the greatest teachers that I was with, they always were, to one degree or another, even if they were within a tradition, they were lights unto themselves. And so the lessons that I took were to study and learn and discern and go with what worked for me. What were those insights that catalyzed my own deepening? You know, we all have spiritual glimpses, we all have satoris, we all have those profound moments where the veils of separation part, and we know without a doubt that consciousness is one and cannot be separated, and that is our inherent nature. But what does it mean to live that? How do we live that? What does it look like in our culture? There's so many different understandings. And you know, oftentimes the program that I founded really comes from those insights that worked best for me. And sometimes I wish that I could don robes and be part of a 2,000-year-old lineage, so that I would know exactly what the right next step was and exactly what to do in the morning and exactly, you know, what to do with this state of mind. But it would feel disingenuous. So I've done a lot of deep practice, and that's where I've come to. And I feel like there are some who are called to a lineage or a tradition, And there are some in our modern world who have the harder path of really going as deep with as much discipline, but without a charted path.
Very good, Amy. Let's talk about the Inner Strength program, because what you described is the challenge. I'm sure all of our listeners, including Dennis and me,
Right.
have wrestled with for decades, namely, applying perennial wisdom to life in today's world and our lives, in unique lives in particular. And you, in engaging young people in school systems, have to adapt to the requirements that entails. You even if you wanted to, you couldn't do certain things.
Exactly.
So tell us about the program first, and what brought you to it, and how you've addressed those issues.
Yeah. What I did is I took those things, like I said, that worked for me and tried to translate them in a way that would be accessible and appropriate for public school education in Philadelphia is the poorest of the 10 largest cities in America. There is a level of deep intergenerational poverty here that rivals some of the worst places I've seen in India. It's devastating. I had lived in rural Massachusetts for 17 years before coming here, and it was so hard on the heart to see the lack of basic resources, access to knowledge, to libraries, to books, to clean water, to supermarkets. And Philadelphia is a small city. You can really walk from side to side in 25 minutes. There's north and south, and it extends and it sprawls a little bit. But I live walking distance from the Liberty Bell, from where our Constitution was written. I can walk by the place where Thomas Jefferson wrote and where they used to drink, Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and where they talked about building a country where people could thrive and their higher human potentials could be released. And we're in a reality that is so desperately far from that. So translating what I had learned, having had the luxury and the privilege of being able to do a lot of deep meditative practice, was interesting. And I decided to go with the basic mindfulness techniques, Theravadan techniques, mindfulness on breath, body scan, love and kindness, and also teach the students some of what I learned about an evolutionary perspective. So they learn about 300 million years of brain science and how the evolution of the brain influences our feelings now. So what's happening as an adolescent, there are certain things happening in the brain. There are a lot of evolutionary tricks that make the brain form that way, that teens learn about that. And they start going, oh, the reason why I listen to my friends and not to my mom is not because I'm just a rebellious good for nothing. It's also evolutionarily programmed into me to bond with my peers, because 150,000 years ago, our parents' generation was about to die out when we were teenagers. We had to bond with our network that was going to help us survive. I also teach them about large-scale cultural shifts. So that really comes from an understanding of, comes out of integral theory, out of different evolutionary philosophies that look at how we, in the postmodern times, in our contemporary era, we have more individuation, more choice, and less social support. Earlier times, simpler living, we had less opportunity to express our individuation, but we had more social support. So I take the kids on a guided meditation back 800 years, and what did they wear? What did they eat? What did they sing? Who did they go to for advice? Then we fast forward, we get a sense of what life is like now, and they start to contextualize their sense of being lost and uprooted, and their love of their ability to have their own hairstyle, their own song list, their own dance moves. It's been really powerful. We've done research on the program, which has been published in peer review journals. We consistently show an increase in self-compassion and self-regulation, and also an increase in some other metrics that are indicative of long-term stability.
Right.
So that's quite something.
Wow.
But I tell you, we are in an uphill battle. Last week, one of our high schools, we lost a senior. He was shot in the chest walking home from school.
Terrible.
And it's not the first time it's happened. So I went from this rarefied time in India and meditation to the stuff on the news is actually the stuff that I'm dealing with. And
I wanted to ask you, Amy, about your experience going and working with kids in the public schools. Back in the early 70s, my father was a school principal in Union City, New Jersey, which is very urban, right by Jersey City, right by the Lincoln Tunnel. And I got him involved in TM, and he was very enthused about it. And he got it into the schools where he wasn't. And the experience was, and I'm curious if this was your experience, kids had great experiences. The teachers that got involved with it had great experiences, but there was a big pushback from certain communities, certain religious communities or whatever, that you can't have this, so have you had that experience in Philadelphia? I mean, you've been involved with 17,000 kids. Have you had any pushback from boards of education or parents or religious groups that you shouldn't be doing this in the schools?
I've always been very careful to really, and the thing that helps having a deep background in Vedanta and in Buddhism, that I know what the roots of things are. So a lot of people who don't have a lot of education and haven't studied some of the original texts, they don't know that they're actually imposing Eastern tradition on Christians or Jews or Muslims. And if you have a better background in world religions, you can make those bridges, you can secularize it, or you can describe how this shows up in different traditions and accommodate many different perspectives. Also, there's a recognition now that didn't exist in the 70s, 80s, 90s, right, and even in the aughts, that there have been enough evidence, research studies that are credible, right, that show that this can be supportive for trauma, it can be supportive for anxiety, can be supportive for negative rumination, and a lot of the things that individuals, not just teens, are struggling with right now. So I think that we're just living in a different time than then, fortunately.
Amy,
evolution, yeah.
How old or how young are the students that you work with? And was there anything in your background that qualified you? Did you study education? Did you have a credential? How did you get into the schools without, if you didn't have that?
You must have, yeah.
I don't have a degree in education. I did study educational theory, regional development, and political science. So I was roughly in that area. But I put together a good program. It went through, it's been recommended as a social emotional learning program by CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, which is a 2.5-year approval process where you have to have third-party research with a control group. So I published a curriculum that was well laid out and we could replicate it with fidelity, so that my teachers were all teaching the same thing. I work with my teachers once a week so that everyone's getting professional development. So everything has been developed in order to comply with the standards of a public school education. And I think that's important. I think anyone who wants to bring a program into the school system should have a lot more rigor than if they're teaching adults on a weekend or in a center or in a gym. I think it needs, this is education, and there are certain standards and that are there for a reason. So I think that's what helped me get into the schools, because I was able to respond to all of their questions.
And the age range?
14 to 19, so ninth to 12th grade.
Great. I'm curious, you mentioned earlier that your father was, I believe, a particle physicist. Yeah. All right. I have met a number of physicists, who, a couple of them, Larry Domash, John Hagelin, friends of mine. Then I've also was able to meet and spend an afternoon with Brian Josephson, the Nobel laureate in physics, and also the guy. I was at a conference, and the other one was I can't think of his name, but he wrote the Tao of Physics. And I'm wondering if you ever had those conversations with your father about Vedic knowledge, interior development, and the physical universe, and how that connection. I mean, it was fascinating. I can't say that I followed it all. But these guys who were first in physics and then got exposed to Eastern knowledge, they were wildly excited about the connection there. But no, that conversation never took place.
Never. My father was a staunch materialist, so what he could measure was what he believed in. Now, the paradox is he was a particle physicist, so he'd speed up electrons and bomb them into nuclei of atoms and then study these particles, which is basically all math. They're not really measuring anything. Right. But he asked me really profound questions from the time I was very young, and that's what really did it. So when he would explain about the atoms and how there's more space than matter, I remember as a 4 and 5-year-old, I would press my hand into the table and I would try to figure out why, if everything's made up of the same pieces, protons, neutrons, and electrons, and there's more space and these electrons are just swirling around, how come when I press my hand on the table, my hand and the table don't merge? And that's what got me going. It really was an early sense of non-separation,
very insightful,
of universality.
Yeah.
I wonder if kids now, because when I was a youngster and I was forced to take a physics or chemistry class, there was no sense of mystery about anything. I wonder if kids today, now that there's some more maturation in the hard sciences, and we have terms like dark matter and dark energy, and on television they talk about how everything is mostly empty space that we don't know anything about. I wonder if that kindles anything. What do you see any of that in school? Do you bring in the sciences into what you're bringing?
I do. I bring in things like the double slit experiment. So is light a particle or a wave? Well, it depends on what you want it to be. And I describe that to them and they're mind blown. Teenagers are teenagers. They're curious about how the world works. And so, we talk about things like that. And I bring in things that I'm interested in and tell them about them. So, but I don't think they're taught that. I think education is, it's really like taken out the curiosity.
But one more question, Dennis, it occurs to me. Do you bring in explicitly what we would think of as religious precepts and concepts, or do you just secularize all the spiritual teachings so there's no church-state issues,
Yes.
Yeah.
I do. And, there's a lot of discussion right now about the colonization of Eastern traditions. And I understand that secularization means that white male science is taking out the wisdom of Eastern traditions and that were Black and brown traditions, and taking them out from the roots and claiming ownership and using the fMRI machine as the authority. I'm guilty of that to some degree because I do base a lot of my argument in science and research. It's pragmatic. But mostly I just allow the students to discover for themselves. So I try not to give them words or concepts like impermanence or no self or interconnectedness. I try not to give them concepts, but I let them explore their experience.
Very good.
And tell us about your new book, Adventure in Zanskar. What brought that about, and what do you hope people get from it?
That's my book. So
yeah, please hold it up again.
I'll hold this up. So that's Adventure in Zanskar. It's my new book. And I will say that I'm quite proud of this one. This one is about the program. It's called The Conscious Classroom.
Oh, very good.
Which
Thanks
is the
for mentioning
principles
it.
of the program. And it won an IPPY Award.
We'll have all that information for our listeners and viewers.
Yeah.
We'll have all that posted up. So yeah.
So this book, it's just very close to my heart. I spent 12 months walking the Himalayas in different regions of North India. And this book is about a 2-month journey that I made on my own in this little part of India, which is the northernmost tip of India. And geographically, it's the westernmost section of the Tibetan Plateau. So it's the oldest Buddhist valley in the world. People have been practicing Buddhism or the Bon religion, which was is early non-dual meditation teachings for hundreds, if not thousands of years, 2,000 years maybe. And I went there, it was only 7 years after the area had been open to travelers, because it's a very contested region. It's China, of course, occupies Tibet on one side. India's the central power. Pakistan is, just on the other side. Tajikistan and Russia are above it. So it's this tiny little valley, but it's in a part of the world that's very contested. And I went there and with a paper map, no GPS, no internet, no roads, no electricity. And I decided that I was going to walk, and I had a rough route that I was going to walk. I really felt like I wanted to be in the high mountains and experience that and feel what it was like to really live in the high mountains. And I also wanted to be with the people, because I had tasted Tibetan culture in Dharamsala and McLeod-Ganj, where I lived for a year. And I really loved the Tibetan people. And I didn't really want to go to Tibet just because it's a different country now, post 1959 and the Chinese takeover, than it was before. But Zanskar was a place where a similar culture had been in existence. And I was so touched when I was there by the compassion, by the lightness of being. They were happy, they were raucous, they were fun-loving. The women were strong, they were fierce, they were wild, they were funny. And I felt like when I was there, not only did I have very deep spiritual experiences, and I had big adventures climbing 16,000 feet with tennis shoes, not climbing, walking up over 16,000 feet with tennis shoes and nothing else. But the people gave me faith in what's possible. And that has stayed with me. That was 1983. So it's a long time ago. It's almost 40 years, right? We're 2022 now. And it gave me hope.
So this is a memoir of that experience, and essentially maybe even a tribute to the people you met.
Yeah, it comes from journals that I wrote at the time. And so it is a memoir, and it takes you through from that time in that voice. It also tells you a bit about Buddhism, about the culture, about, I was exploring questions at the time of the Westernization and questioning the impact I was having. I wanted to be there. I was somewhat culturally sensitive, but I knew I was an American, and that was going to leave a footprint that I wished it wouldn't, but I knew it was going to. So I questioned a lot of those things at the time, and all of those layers are in the book.
What do you hope readers get out of it?
What I hope and what I've heard is all different levels of people have feel inspired and encouraged. So I've met people who've read this who are like us, or they've been spiritual practitioners for 40, 50 years, and they felt reinvigorated and inspired again. So that really touched me. And I've met 20 somethings and 30 somethings who said, your struggle with your mind is the same as my struggle with my mind. And the way that you were able to work with that gave me some footing to deal with my own, whatever it is, anxiety, neurosis, fear.
Very good.
Arrogance.
Any final points or that you'd like to leave our listeners and viewers with?
Well, I would encourage everyone to have no limits on the adventure that you can have right now, whether it's the pandemic or whether you feel like the great adventures have already been done and there's nothing left, that there's an inner adventure that's calling, and it's important, and the world needs it. The world needs bright lights. The world needs people who are happy. The world needs people who shine with spiritual sustenance and that richness of a deeply considered inner life that's dedicated to bringing a higher order of coexistence into this world. We just need it. Nothing could be more important right now. So that's what I'd encourage everyone to do, and take care of themselves.
Great message. Thank you so very much, Amy.
I have one final question, if I may. You were part of a spiritual community for a long time in a rural place. Now you're in a big city, working in rugged neighborhoods and all that. Is there anything, do you miss being in the community? Are there things you miss about the community? Are there things you're happy to not be part of anymore? I ask this because I know so many people, including Dennis and me, who were once part of a tight-knit spiritual community. There's a feeling of liberation when you're on your own and you're independent, and there's also stuff you miss. Do you experience that?
I feel like I don't miss anything. I feel that I fulfilled that yearning of being together. And I feel like a lot of things that I learned about the dynamics of human interaction have enabled me to be very compassionate with the suffering of people who grow up in a very different life than mine. Because when you go through spiritual trials and tribulations, you're pushed to the edge in many different ways. And I'm able to understand and recognize trauma and recognize where a certain type of container needs to be held so somebody can come through on their own, in their own time, and in their own way. So it's really helped me with that, and really be able to be there for people who have very different life experiences than me. I think that the great master Thich Nhat Hanh passed recently last week, and I wanted to watch and participate in some of the live stream of the honoring of his life, and I was very moved by his Sangha. He created a beautiful community, and although I don't long to join a community like that, I think that the presence of a community that is so caring and deep practitioners is an important it's an important marker or holder in culture for people, and for people who haven't experienced deep community, I would encourage them, if they're polled, to find a place like that and do a short retreat just to experience what that level of commitment can look like in a collective.
Right. I just wanted to add to that there's a line in Somerset Maugham's book, The Razor's Edge, which that book had a big impact on me back in the day. And the teacher was saying to the main character, it's easy to be enlightened. I forget the exact words, on a mountaintop. It's when you go into the, and he was going back, and so you live in a community, you have the deep spiritual experience and all, then you take it into the world, and there's more challenge there, and then you really see how much you've stabilized that inner development, inner life, and obviously from your work and the success of your work, you've brought that enlightenment into the world, and have held it, and in a position to share it with others. But probably it was your time being more inward and away from everything that helped to develop that strength that you brought into the world and continue to bring in.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We love the work you're doing in the schools. We recommend people look into it, and
If you could hold up
follow
the
the
book
links. And Adventures in Zanskar, a young woman's solitary journey to reach physical and metaphysical heights.
There you go.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Keep up the good work.
There you go.
Hold on, I have to. Why am I not seeing how to shut off the video?
Don't edit this out. It's a good part.
Okay.
Top left.
Very real.
Now I see it.
Bill, that was Amy Edelstein. Like many of our guests, she has had a long and complex spiritual journey. She's really been to the Chinese, India, Western elements of it. And what's most impressive to me is she spent all that time in India, all that time in the East, and then comes back to Philadelphia and is working with high school kids. Pretty amazing. And it's easier said than done, because look, I was in India for 2 weeks and I came back and I went to seriously. I mean, it was like, you're like, stunned for a while. She was there for 4 years, and you've spent a lot of time in India.
Yeah, but never more than a month.
What's that?
Never more than a month at a time.
Yeah, so she's there to come back like that. It's just really got to be mind-boggling. But she seemed very even, very centered, and whatever her practice, obviously she's, it's created great steadiness and focus in her. She
is a real dedicated practitioner and seeker of wisdom. There's a lot of people have a kind of casual approach to spirituality. They're focused on, whatever occupies their career for much of the day, and they have slots for their spirituality. They may take it seriously, but it's not dominant.
Right.
But then
you made an interesting point during the interview where you said, like, having experienced being very in a tight-knit spiritual community of like-minded people, when you're in that tight-knit community, it's very easy to maintain your practice and all that. When you come out of it, on the one hand, you feel relaxed. You're not part of a group, and there's a certain liberating feeling that comes from that. But on the other hand, it takes a little bit more discipline, a little bit more focus to maintain the practice, the benefits that you were getting, and creating a balance there. And
But
another
she's one of those people who is truly devoted to her spiritual life, and it expressed itself in different ways, that commitment and that yearning in different ways throughout her life, which are fascinating.
right.
But
And I think what
even now, her work
right.
is focused, into bringing what she's learned into, the lives of other young people.
Yeah,
So,
and that's not it. That's not necessarily an easy thing. And the other thing that was fascinating is that most people, when they go on a spiritual journey like that, wind up with one teacher, one path, one. She seems to have taken a little bit or a lot from a variety of teachings and put them together. And coming from a family that had a very strong academic background, her father was a particle physicist and probably working in very abstract areas of math, very materialistic, and she took a different route. But she said her father, continually asked her very,
well, my father was a plumber,
innovative questions. Yeah,
and so I didn't I didn't have that
right.
same kind of upbringing, but it was similar in that my parents also were secular Jews who had nothing to do with religion. So they weren't academics. They were working class and always struggling financially. But they were smart, and they taught me to ask tough questions and to think for myself. And I'll bet it was very similar, in Amy's household. So having that kind of one of the things I've learned when because I've interviewed so many hundreds of people for my books, sometimes people who come from religious backgrounds and just shift to a different kind of spirituality, they have to unlearn a lot. And people who grew up like with atheist parents and materialist parents, they too have to unlearn a lot when they get on a spiritual path. But if you grew up in an inquisitive household like I did, it was actually, for me, it was not as much, I didn't have as much to unlearn as some of the people I knew who grew up in religious households.
Right.
It was a part of an open inquiry
Right.
into life for me.
Because I think when you're in a religious household, you're told these are all the answers. You have all the answers. You don't have, and then you have to sort of break from that. And there's a resistance to do that, especially if it's put into you. Like in Catholicism, you have this thing, catechism. Who made me? God made me. Why did God make me? It was called the Baltimore Catechism. And I found the book recently in my garage, and it really this is it, and then to break from that. And the other thing is, you mentioned, people that come from working class background, you get to see all types of people.
Yeah.
You get to meet, and one of the things my father,
especially if you grew up in Brooklyn, like I did.
But I was born in Jersey City. My father was the first in his family to go to college. But before that, he worked 4 years after high school. My mother went to work when she was 14. And as my father would always say, you go to college. He would warn me. He said, you're going to meet all kinds of people like you. They like to read. The world's not made up of people like that. The world's made up of all kinds of people. So you got to go out in the world. I always had to have a job. I always had to mingle. In the summers, summer meant work. I couldn't wait to go back to school most of the time. And it was like, but you met all kinds of people, and you respect that. Whereas if you're just around people that have similar education, similar backgrounds, you don't get that diversity. There's something lost in that. And I think people on a spiritual quest, it's good and important to have a real diversity of people that you're interacting with.
Well, that's often what triggers a spiritual quest. It's like I knew a lot of people who grew up in religious households, and they adopted that. And then they go off to college and they find different ways of looking at the world, and things shift. similar, with me. I grew up with anti-religious Marxist, parents who thought religion was the opium of the people. And then, it's during my college years, I came up, I wanted, to know more. I wanted truth. And, I was exposed to things.
Right. Well, did you experience that once you were meditating and once you were in a spiritual path, that you went back and said, I have to look at Judaism from that angle. There was some something.
Yeah, I never did because I never had much of a Jewish upbringing.
Right.
The religious aspect of Judaism was never part of my growing up. As an adult, I have more respect for it than I did growing up, of course. But it's never drawn me as a spiritual path. It's
Right.
drawn me as a matter of a curiosity and wanting to know more about all the world's traditions.
Right.
So I've learned more about it and have high regard for it, just as I do all the other traditions. But I never felt personally that it was my path.
Right. I grew up Catholic, and my parents were very open-minded. No, all religions were fine, or no religion was fine. But I didn't go to Catholic school, but I did come to the point where I embraced it, and then I totally rejected it. Then I started a TM, and I started meditating and studying, and be on a serious spiritual path. And then I looked back and I thought, well, yeah, there was good and bad. I was sort of in the middle on it. There were some things that were good there, but boy, they really went off the road on this one. And that what was also disturbing, and I think it was the narrow-mindedness that this is the way it is. And
But
so,
you had great food, Dennis.
what's that?
You had great food.
Well, depends. No, actually we didn't, because when I grew up, I'm going to tell you this. They would, well, I had good food at home, but the Italians went to the Italian Catholic Church. The Irish went to the Irish Catholic Church. My father, for whatever reason, felt that the head of the priest that ran the Catholic Church, the Italian Catholic Church, Our Lady of Libra, was a little too mixed up with the mob, So we went to the Slavic Church, and I had to sit there as a kid and listen to lectures in Slavic. And then when they had some kind of feast or meal, it was this Kabbasian stuff that I couldn't, that didn't ring a bell for me, because I'm used to pasta and, Italian.
I always used to envy my Italian friends because they had much better food.
The feast.
Anyway, hey, back to Amy Edelstein.
Yeah, great book. We're going to get that book out there to folks. Great story. And, it's like the story of Shangri-La, and I think people, when they read that, will get inspired that, there is a possibility that we can have a brighter world, because right now we're not living in, most people would think we're not living in Shangri-La right now. And
no, I wish I'd thought of asking her if she knows what that part of the world is like now.
Right. Because she was there 40 years ago.
Years later.
I was thinking that
a lot of those I've been to places in India that people I know were in 40, 50 years ago, and they describe it very differently from what I see now. Right. India those places have changed, and civilization has come to many of those places, and population growth has come, and political upheavals. So I wonder what it's like now. But one of the interesting things about Amy and her life, and it's in the book, is, a lot of people, when we were young and got on a spiritual quest in the 70s, 60s, 70s, not everybody went and trekked in the mountains of, and lived among, village people and all that. That's very adventurous.
She was very, she did a lot of trekking, and she went off she wasn't on the main highway. She went off, very impressive what she did, and what she gained and gathered from it, because it was a rugged path, just physically hard to do that type of travel, and even today. But in any event, well, very insightful. I think it's fantastic that she's working with kids. She's working from kids from underserved communities, And
I
I'm
know
sure
a lot
that-
of people who have tried to create school programs to bring meditation and mindfulness and yoga. It's not easy, and they often have, difficulty.
Well, the other thing is that, and I brought that up, that I'm surprised she hasn't gotten more resistance because
Yeah,
I mentioned my father helped get TM into the schools, and I know the David Lynch Foundation, they were always battling, and in Encinitas, California, the
that
yoga group
lawsuit.
there they got into a court case, and that was one of the few court cases where the yoga people won,
Right.
and so there's always, and again, it's that narrow-mindedness that, oh, it's not from our tradition, it's not Christian, it's not this, that, so we can't let it in. So
But
it's
she obviously packaged it
yeah,
very well and satisfied the requirements. So, kudos to her.
right,
So another good interview.
excellent.
Everybody
Oh,
out there, subscribe.
Subscribe, hit the subscribe button. Would mean a lot to us if you did that, and whether you're listening or watching, and write us, tell us what you're thinking. We have more and more guests coming, and some really terrific ones. They're all good.
Yeah, and you discover interesting people like Amy Edelstein, who you may not have come across otherwise. That's one of our missions, is to interview famous people and people who
People that
should
should be famous. And the other thing I would say is that often people and this are out and they're seekers, they're spiritual, they're looking for more, and they feel very alone because maybe they're in a community or a family, whatever, that's not like them. You're not alone. Just
Not
go to
alone.
our archives. All
Okay,
right.
next
Next time.
time.